There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1967 at Olympic Sound Studios in Barnes, southwest London. It is not a famous photograph. It did not make the cover of any magazine. In it, a young man sits in the corner of a dimly lit recording studio, a sitar resting across his knees. His hair, the color of straw, falls across his face. His eyes are closed. On the floor beside him, a half-empty bottle of Johnny Walker catches the light from the mixing desk. Behind the glass partition, two other young men are working, one singing into a microphone, the other hunched over an electric guitar, adjusting a tuning peg. They are recording. They are creating. They do not look at the man in the corner. His name was Brian Jones. He had founded this band. He had chosen its members. He had given it a name, taken from a Muddy Waters song, because he believed that the blues of the Mississippi Delta was the truest music on earth and deserved to be heard in London, in Manchester, in every town that had forgotten how to feel. 5 years earlier, he had stood on the stage of the Marquee Club on Oxford Street, and the audience had screamed his name. He was the leader. He was the face. He was the Rolling Stones. Now he sat in a corner with an instrument nobody had asked him to play, waiting for someone to notice he was still in the room. According to the recording engineer Glyn Johns, no relation, who was behind the desk that evening, the young man eventually opened his eyes, looked around the empty studio, and said quietly, "They've gone, haven't they?" Johns nodded. A pause, fair enough, and he closed his eyes again. How does a man who lit the fire end up outside the circle of its light? How does the architect of a sound that would shake the world, that would sell 300 million records and fill stadiums for 6 decades, become invisible inside his own creation? To understand, one must go back 25 years, to a town in the west of England where everything was proper, everything was orderly, and everything was suffocating. Cheltenham, in the county of Gloucestershire, is the sort of place the English have always been rather good at building and rather less good at escaping. A Regency spa town of wide promenades and white stucco terraces, it sits at the edge of the Cotswolds like a well-pressed handkerchief on a green velvet cushion. In the 1940s, it was a town of retired colonels and piano teachers, of church fayettes and clipped hedges, of net curtains that twitched at the slightest irregularity. Lewis Blount Jones was an aeronautical engineer by profession and a pianist by inclination. He led the church choir, played Chopin after supper, and ran his household with the quiet precision of a man who believed that order was the highest virtue. His wife Louisa taught piano to neighborhood children. She was warm where her husband was measured, gentle where he was rigid, but she deferred to him in all matters of consequence, as wives of her generation were expected to do. Together, they lived on El Dorado Road, in a neat, semi-detached house that smelled of furniture, polish, and propriety. Their first son, Lewis Brian Hopkin Jones, arrived on the 28th of February, 1942. The war was still raging, and Cheltenham, being far from the coast, had become a haven for evacuees and government offices. The boy was born into safety, into comfort, into the careful silence of a house where emotions were played on the piano but rarely spoken aloud. He was 3 years old when the silence became absolute. His sister Pamela had been born 2 years after him, a small, dark-haired girl whom Louisa adored with the fierce tenderness of a mother who had survived the Blitz. In 1945, Pamela fell ill. Leukemia. She was 2. The doctors could do nothing. One winter morning, the little girl died in the upstairs bedroom while her brother stood in the corridor outside the closed door, too young to understand death, but old enough to feel its weight in the air. He knocked on the door. Nobody opened it. Lewis sat at the piano in the front room. The lid was raised. His hands rested on the keys, but he did not play. Lewisa remained in the bedroom. And the boy, the 3-year-old boy who would one day become the most gifted multi-instrumentalist in British rock and roll, stood alone in the hallway of a house that had, in the space of a single morning, become a mausoleum. A second daughter, Barbara, was born the following year, but the emotional fracture had already set. Lewis and Lewisa never fully emerged from their grief. They loved their surviving children. There is no reason to doubt that, but the house on El Dorado Road had acquired a permanent chill, a sense that joy was something that had happened once and been revoked. At the age of 4, the boy developed a severe case of croup that led to chronic asthma. The wheezing attacks came at night, tightening his chest like a fist, leaving him gasping in the dark. Lewisa would rush to his bedside, hold him upright, rub his back. Lewis would stand in the doorway, watching, saying little. The pattern was set early. The mother's warmth, the father's distance, and the child caught between them, fragile in body and hungry for something neither parent could quite provide. He was clever, ferociously, almost insultingly clever. At Dean Close School and later at Cheltenham Grammar School, the boy sailed through examinations with a minimum of effort, collecting at least 7 O-levels, possibly 9, depending on which account one trusts, while barely appearing to study. He could absorb information the way a sponge absorbs water, effortlessly, completely, with a faintly irritating lack of visible exertion. His teachers noted his intelligence. They also noted his attitude. He was, in the parlance of school reports, disruptive. He was a negative influence on other pupils. He was, in plain English, a rebel. The rebellion began with sound. One afternoon, the precise date is lost, but he was perhaps 14 or 15. A school friend played him a record by Charlie Parker. The alto saxophone wailed and swooped through the tiny speaker of a portable gramophone, and something shifted behind the boy's eyes. Under the bed covers at night, he tuned a transistor radio to Radio Luxembourg and let the forbidden frequencies wash over him, rhythm and blues from America, skiffle from London, the electric howl of a world his father had never mentioned and would never approve of. The boy began to play. Clarinet first, in the school orchestra, alongside the oboe, then alto saxophone, then guitar. The guitar was the one that changed everything. He heard a recording of Elmore James playing Dust My Broom, and the sound of the slide guitar, that keening, metallic wail, like a human voice trapped inside a steel string, entered him and never left. He taught himself to play it from records, pressing a glass bottleneck against the frets, bending the notes until they cried. No one in Britain was doing this. Not in 1957. He was the first. His father disapproved. The details vary depending on the source, but the confrontation over the blues, Lewis's rigid hostility toward this raw American music polluting his house, was real and documented by multiple biographers. There were no screams. In the Jones household, rage was expressed through silence, through the withdrawal of approval, through a gesture rather than a shout. The boy played on regardless. At a school assembly, and this, remarkably, is confirmed, the teenager stood before his classmates and declared that the entire British education system was a farce. His father was summoned by the headmaster. The boy was suspended. Twice. He did not care. He had found the blues. And the blues, unlike Lewis Blount Jones, did not judge you for feeling too much. There was, however, another dimension to the rebellion, one that Cheltenham would find far harder to forgive. Before Pat Andrews, before Linda Lawrence, before any of the names that would later populate the biographies, there were others unnamed, undocumented, barely more than shadows. A child born when the boy was barely 16. Sex unknown. Name unknown. The baby vanished into the sealed files of a county adoption agency, as such things did in the late 1950s. Then another girl, another pregnancy, another adoption. Then Valerie Corbett, a son, Barry David, born on the 29th of May, 1960, adopted and given the name Simon. Then a married woman known only as Angeline, a daughter, Belinda, born on the 4th of August, 1960, raised by her mother and stepfather. 4 children, possibly more, by the age of 18. In a town where a crooked fence post was cause for gossip, this was not scandal. It was exile. And then there was Pat Andrews. Pat was different. Pat was real, or at least as close to real as the young musician from Cheltenham would ever permit. They met in 1960, when he was 18 and already possessed of the luminous, androgynous beauty that would later hypnotize millions. They set up home together, if a cramped bedsit could be called a home, and on the 22nd of October, 1961, their son was born. He named him Julian Mark, after the jazz saxophonist Julian Cannonball Adderley. It was a name he would use again. On Sunday mornings, the young father would push the pram down the main street. Neighbors crossed the road to avoid him. He smiled at them as they crossed. There was something in that smile, not defiance exactly, but a kind of bright, sharp knowingness, as though he understood precisely what they thought and found it faintly amusing. Beneath the smile, though, was something else, something that would take years to identify and a lifetime to fail to repair. In the summer of 1959, the teenager had put a change of clothes into a rucksack, picked up his guitar, and hitchhiked to Scandinavia. He busked on street corners in Copenhagen, playing blues standards for coins and meals. He later told friends it was the only week of his life when he felt at home. He returned to Cheltenham a different person. The town was a cage now, and the bars were closing in. There was only one way out, west, to London, where the music lived and the rules did not apply. In London, the young man reinvented himself. He took a pseudonym, Elmo Lewis, after his hero Elmore James, and drifted through menial jobs by day. By night, he haunted the rhythm and blues clubs sprouting in the damp cellars of Soho and Ealing. At the Ealing Club, he encountered Alexis Corner, the avuncular godfather of British blues, who ran a loose collective called Blues Incorporated. Corner recognized the young guitarist's talent immediately. Through Corner's circle, the boy from Cheltenham met Charlie Watts, a quietly immaculate jazz drummer, and Jack Bruce, a Scottish bassist with a temper and a virtuoso technique. In the spring of 1962, Jones placed a classified advertisement in Jazz News. A young rhythm and blues guitarist sought musicians to form a new group. 2 young men from Dartford in Kent responded. One was a student at the London School of Economics with oversized lips and a strut that suggested practice in front of a mirror. His name was Michael Philip Jagger. The other was a thin, dark-haired guitarist with a skull ring and an encyclopedic knowledge of Chuck Berry riffs. His name was Keith Richards. They met, they played, and something happened in that room that none of them could have named. A year earlier, on the other side of the Pennines, another beautiful young visionary had walked away from another band that would become legendary. Stuart Sutcliffe left the Beatles in 1961. He was dead of a brain hemorrhage within 6 months. The name came from muddy waters. The Chicago bluesman had recorded a song called Rolling Stone in 1950, and Jones seized upon it. The Rolling Stones, his band, his name, his vision. The first performance took place on the 12th of July, 1962, at the Marquee Club on Oxford Street. The lineup included Jones, Jagger, Richards, the pianist Ian Stewart, the bassist Dick Taylor, and a drummer named Tony Chapman, both of whom would depart within months, to be replaced by Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts. The audience was small. The sound was raw. The energy was volcanic. Within weeks, the founder had established himself as the undisputed leader. He booked the rehearsals. He selected the repertoire. He negotiated with club owners. And in a detail that would poison the well for years, he quietly arranged to receive an extra £5 per performance above what the other members were paid. He was the leader, and leaders deserve more. When Jagger and Richards discovered the arrangement, the betrayal cut deep. £5, a pittance, also the price of an empire. In the spring of 1963, a 19-year-old aspiring impresario named Andrew Loog Oldham watched the Stones perform and understood immediately that he was looking at a fortune. Oldham was sharp, ambitious, and possessed of an almost predatory instinct for commercial potential. He offered to manage the group. They accepted. And in that moment, the balance of power began its long, irreversible shift. Oldham made a choice. He chose Jagger. Not because Jagger was more talented, that was debatable then and remains debatable now, but because Jagger was manageable. The founder was not. He was volatile, unpredictable, and operated on instinct rather than strategy. Oldham's second decision was more brutal. Ian Stewart, the pianist, one of the original members, was removed from the official lineup because he looked, in Oldham's estimation, insufficiently like a rock and roll star. He was relegated to road manager and occasional session player, a ghost member haunting the edges of the group he had helped build. The third decision mattered most. Oldham encouraged Jagger and Richards to write their own songs. This was not merely artistic, it was financial. In the 1960s, the money lay in publishing royalties. Whoever wrote the songs controlled the revenue. And since the founder did not write songs, had never written songs, he was, in economic terms, expendable. This was the central paradox. He could play anything. Sitar, marimba, recorder, mellotron, oboe, and a dozen others that most people had never heard of. He would pick up an instrument he had never seen before, and within an hour play it better than its owner. Charlie Watts would later say, "He was the most talented of all of us, no question. He could pick up any instrument and in an hour play it better than you could in a year. It was frightening." He created the sonic identity of the Rolling Stones. Every distinctive texture in their mid-60s recordings, the droning sitar, the dancing marimba, the mournful slide guitar, the ethereal recorder, came from his hands. Without his arrangements, Under My Thumb would be a forgettable shuffle. Without his sitar, Paint It Black would lack its hypnotic drone. Without his recorder, Ruby Tuesday would lose its aching sweetness. He was the architect of the sound, but he did not write the songs. And in the brutal economics of the British music industry, the architect was worth less than the men who signed the contracts. In the early days, when the Stones were still playing for beer money, he would pilfer loose change from the cash registers at their rehearsal venues. "Equipment fund," he would say, grinning, if anyone noticed. He was too magnetic to stay angry at. That was always his gift, and eventually his curse. Prince Stash de Roller, a friend from those years, remembered him with admiration and wariness. He could destroy a person with a single sentence, and a second later make them laugh until they cried. At home, the wreckage accumulated quietly. Pat Andrews had followed him to London, hoping for something resembling a family. What she got was intermittent devotion punctuated by long absences. One night, after a performance, he came home at 4 in the morning, lifted the sleeping infant from his cot, and played him "Dust My Broom" on an acoustic guitar for half an hour. Pat stood in the doorway and wept, not from sadness exactly, but from the helpless recognition that this man was capable of extraordinary gentleness and utterly incapable of sustaining it. By 1963, they had separated. In 1966, Pat filed a paternity suit. He agreed to maintenance payments without contest. There were others. Linda Lawrence, gentle, pretty, from a good family. Their son, Julian Bryan, was born on the 23rd of July, 1964. A second Julian. The same name, the same devotion to Cannonball Adderley, as though by naming his sons identically, he might somehow fuse them into the single, perfect child he could never stay long enough to raise. Linda would later marry the folk singer Donovan, and the boy would be renamed Julian Leitch. Then Dawn Molly, a son, Paul Andrew, born in October of 1964, adopted. The founder paid £700 in settlement and moved on. Bill Wyman, the Stones' bassist, remembered the early version of the founder with undisguised affection. "I miss the Brian who existed at the beginning, radiant, mad, impossibly alive." On tour in those first years, they slept 3 to a bed, stole food from hotel kitchens, and played to audiences who sometimes numbered in the dozens. These were the golden days, chaotic, penniless, incandescent with promise. By 1965, he was 23 years old. He had fathered at least 4 children by 4 different women and sustained no relationship longer than 2 years. He had no family. He had a band that was rapidly ceasing to be his. And then there was a brief collision, 3 months, no more, with Nico, the German model who would become the glacial voice of the Velvet Underground. 2 exquisitely damaged people in a cloud of hashish smoke. It ended as abruptly as it began. And then he met Anita. And everything, the beauty, the violence, the music, the disintegration, accelerated towards its conclusion. She entered his life in the autumn of 1965, backstage at a Stones concert in Munich. Her name was Anita Pallenberg. She was 23, German-Italian, a model and actress who spoke 4 languages, had studied art under the patronage of the Living Theatre in Rome, and moved through the worlds of Andy Warhol and Federico Fellini with the easy confidence of a woman who understood that beauty, properly deployed, was a form of power. She was stunning in the way that a forest fire is stunning, mesmerizing, destructive, impossible to look away from. What she said to him, by her own account given in an interview decades later, was this: "Take off that ugly shirt." What he said in return is less certain. Pallenberg would recall, with a half-smile that suggested the memory still amused her. He looked at me as if I were the only person in the room. Then he smiled and said something like, "What do you suggest instead?" Within an hour, we were together. Within a week, they were inseparable. Within a month, they were living together. And for roughly 18 months, from the autumn of 1965 to the spring of 1967, they burned with a mutual intensity that those who witnessed it described in terms more appropriate to a natural disaster than a love affair. She became his stylist, his muse, his collaborator in the construction of the androgynous image that made him the most visually arresting figure in British pop culture. The velvet jackets, the scarves, the kohl-rimmed eyes, the deliberate blurring of masculine and feminine, all of this was Anita's influence, or rather the product of two narcissists who looked at each other and saw a mirror worth staring into. Together, they traveled to Morocco, where the founder recorded the master musicians of the Jaujauka tribe in the Rif Mountains, a project that would eventually become the first world music album in the Western rock tradition, though he would not live to see its release. Together, they experimented with LSD, marijuana, hashish, and increasingly with the harder substances, amphetamines, barbiturates, that would corrode the foundation of everything they had built. In 1967, they co-produced a German film called Mord und Totschlag, A Degree of Murder, a low-budget psychedelic drama in which Pallenberg starred and for which the founder composed part of the soundtrack. The film was a commercial failure, but the fact of its existence contradicts the narrative that would later be imposed upon him, that by 1967 he was already a spent force, a passenger, a decorative ruin. He was not. His energy was immense. It simply had nowhere to go inside the Rolling Stones, and so it spilled outward into side projects and foreign adventures, and the arms of a woman who matched him in brilliance and exceeded him in ruthlessness. There were provocations that served no purpose beyond provocation itself. He was photographed wearing a Nazi uniform, his boot placed on the head of a German woman. There was no ideology behind it. This was a man simultaneously involved with a German, an Italian, and half of cosmopolitan Chelsea. But the image reached the press and became another piece of shrapnel in the ongoing explosion of his public life. By late 1966, the golden period was over. The founder's paranoia, always present, like a low hum beneath the music, had intensified to a pitch that made daily life with him an exercise in psychological endurance. He was convinced that Jagger and Richards were conspiring against him, maneuvering to seize control of the band he had built. He was not entirely wrong. The songwriting partnership had become the commercial engine of the Stones, and Oldham's strategy of promoting them as the creative core had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The founder was being edged toward the periphery, not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, grinding accumulation of small exclusions. A track recorded without him. A decision taken in his absence. A glance exchanged between Jagger and Richards that said, more clearly than words, "He is not one of us." The violence surfaced in Morocco. In March of 1967, the couple were in Tangier, part of a larger entourage that included Richards and various hangers-on. The founder was drinking heavily, taking pills, smoking hash, and descending into a paranoid fury that found its outlet in the woman beside him. He struck Pallenberg. He struck her again. By some accounts, he broke her hand. By others, a finger or her wrist. The precise injury varies across sources, but the brutality does not. It was confirmed by Richards, by Pallenberg herself, and by multiple witnesses. There was another incident, grotesque in its specificity, that several biographers have recorded. After one beating, the founder offered Pallenberg an evening with prostitutes as a form of apology, a gesture so warped, so profoundly disconnected from any recognizable form of human tenderness, that it reads less as cruelty than as the flailing of a man who had never learned the language of intimacy and was now too broken to acquire it. And then Keith took Anita. The details are agreed upon by all three participants. The founder fell ill in Tangier, genuinely, or perhaps conveniently, depending on which account one trusts. Richards and Pallenberg offered to drive ahead. They drove to the coast. They caught a ferry to Spain. They did not come back. He woke alone in a hotel room in North Africa. The woman he loved was gone. She had left with the man who played guitar in his band, the man who, 5 years earlier, had answered a classified advertisement in Jazz News and turned up at a rehearsal room with a skull ring and a cigarette. The betrayal was not merely romantic, it was existential. She had not left him for a stranger. She had left him for someone who sat beside him on stage every night, who shared the same dressing rooms and tour buses and recording studios. Every time he looked at Richards, for the rest of his life, which would not be long, he would see the man who had taken the one person he believed could save him. The more credible accounts say he did not leave his hotel room for several days. The Stones eventually sent a car to retrieve him. Years later, in an interview given in 2008, Pallenberg reflected on the relationship with a candor that was, by then, her only remaining currency. "I'm guilty. I know that. I left him and it broke him. But if I'd stayed, he would have broken me. We were two shards of glass, and together we only cut each other." After Anita, something inside him, the nerve, the spark, the incandescent filament that had made him the most vivid presence in any room, burned out. Into the darkness rushed the police, the pharmaceuticals, and the slow, methodical dismantling of everything he had ever been. On the 10th of May, 1967, at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at the door of a flat on Courtfield Road in South Kensington. It was not a polite knock. The young man who opened the door was wearing a dressing gown. His hair was uncombed. Behind him, on a table in the front room, sat a sitar, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and a small quantity of substances that the Metropolitan Police would shortly catalogue with bureaucratic precision. Cannabis, resin, cocaine, methadone. It was the year of the great narcotics panic. A week before the raid on Courtfield Road, Jagger and Richards had been arrested at Redlands, Richards' country house in Sussex. The establishment was hunting rock stars with the methodical fervour of a Victorian game warden, and the man from Cheltenham, who lacked Jagger's cunning and Richards' defiance, was the easiest quarry of all. At the subsequent trial, he admitted to using cannabis, but denied knowledge of the harder substances. The tabloid newspapers erupted. One headline screamed, "Cocaine found." This was factually incorrect. Cocaine had not been found in the quantities implied, and the founder, sitting in the dock in a velvet suit that made him look less like a defendant than a bewildered elf, was observed to laugh. The magistrate did not share his amusement. He received a conditional discharge. A reporter from the Times wrote a line that captured the strange pathos of the scene. He looked like a child caught stealing sweets, not like a dangerous criminal. The second arrest, 13 months later, was almost a carbon copy, except that this time the evidence was even thinner. A ball of cannabis resin hidden inside a ball of wool in a flat he had only just moved into. His lawyers argued plausibly that the drugs belonged to previous tenants. It made no difference. £50 plus costs, and a warning from the judge that reads across the decades like an epitaph: "Do not cross this line again." The fine was trivial. The consequence was not. 2 narcotics convictions meant that he could no longer obtain a visa to enter the United States. Without American tour, which accounted for roughly 60% of the Rolling Stones' income, the band's most gifted instrumentalist had become its most expensive liability. He had ceased to be a creative problem. He was now a financial one. He was convinced someone was feeding information to the police. Years later, declassified documents would confirm that MI5 had indeed kept files on the Stones, though whether this extended to active provocation was never proved. The simpler explanation is probably the true one. The Metropolitan Police were targeting every visible rock musician in London, and the man from Cheltenham, who was neither as careful as Richards nor as well counselled as Jagger, was the easiest to catch. His body was failing. The asthma that had plagued him since childhood worsened. His liver, subjected to a daily regimen of whiskey, wine, and barbiturates, had enlarged to twice its normal size, a fact that would not be confirmed until the post-mortem, but that his doctors had begun to suspect when he was 25. His heart, too, was enlarged. He was a young man wrapped in the beautiful exterior of a pop star, with the internal organs of a middle-aged alcoholic. He was admitted to the Priory Clinic in Roehampton on at least one occasion. The diagnosis, couched in the vague language of 1960s psychiatry, was nervous exhaustion. By modern standards, he was almost certainly suffering from severe depression, complicated by paranoid ideation and polysubstance dependence. Late in 1967, he telephoned John Lennon at 3 o'clock in the morning. He wept for 40 minutes. Lennon, who was not a naturally patient man, but who recognized genuine despair when he heard it, stayed on the line. He later told Yoko Ono, "He sounded like he was calling from the other side." One member of the Rolling Stones did not abandon him. Charlie Watts continued to visit throughout the long decline. He would arrive unannounced, sit down, and simply be present. Sometimes they talked. Often they did not. Watts said later, "I couldn't help him, but I could at least not disappear." In the studio, the exile deepened. The recording of Their Satanic Majesty's Request, released in December of 1967, saw the founder contribute to multiple tracks, but his parts were systematically reduced during the mixing process. He was present in the room, but increasingly absent from the recordings. Beggar's Banquet, released in December of 1968, was worse or better, depending on one's perspective, because it contained his finest recorded moment. On most tracks he was absent or marginal, but on No Expectations he arrived at the studio sober, a rare occurrence by that stage, picked up an acoustic guitar, and played a slide part of such devastating, liquid beauty that the entire band fell silent. One take, no corrections. Keith Richards acknowledged it decades later. That was the old Brian for 5 minutes. and then he disappeared again. It was a musical epitaph delivered while its subject was still breathing. The paradox was excruciating. While his own band was erasing him, other musicians sought him out. John Lennon invited him to play saxophone on You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. He contributed sound effects to Yellow Submarine. Jimi Hendrix brought him in to play percussion on All Along the Watchtower. The most versatile instrumentalist in British rock was unwanted in his own studio and in demand everywhere else. In that same year, another band was performing a similar amputation. Pink Floyd, built around the visionary brilliance of Syd Barrett, replaced their founder when his behavior became impossible to accommodate. Barrett would live to the age of 60, spending his final decades in seclusion in Cambridge. The musician from Cheltenham would not reach 28, but until his final day he would keep trying to play. He needed a home, not a flat in Chelsea, not a hotel room in Tangier, a home. In November of 1968, he found one. Cotchford Farm sits in the village of Hartfield in East Sussex, on the northern edge of Ashdown Forest. It is a handsome, rambling farmhouse of brick and timber, surrounded by gardens that slope down to a stream. In the garden stands a bronze statue of a small boy holding an umbrella. The boy is Christopher Robin. The house had once belonged to Alan Alexander Milne, the creator of Winnie-the-Pooh, who had written his most famous stories here in the 1920s, while his real son played in the woods beyond the fence. A man who had never been given a childhood bought the house where the most beloved childhood in English literature had been invented. He paid approximately £30,000 from his share of the Stones' royalties and moved in with a sense of purpose that surprised those who had written him off. For the first few weeks he was happy, or something close to it. He made plans to restore the house, to plant a garden, to write a book about the blues. He walked in Ashdown Forest. He was polite to the local shopkeepers, quiet in the village pub, and according to the testimony of several Hartfield residents, nothing at all like what one might expect a rock star to be. There was a gentleness to him in those weeks, a fragile optimism, as though the house and the garden and the statue of the small bronze boy had granted him permission to begin again. Her name was Anna Wolin. She was Swedish, 22 years old, a student. They had met in early 1969, the precise date uncertain. She came to live with him at Cotchford Farm, and her account of those final months paints a portrait of a man suspended between hope and oblivion. He was like a child seeing the ocean for the first time, she wrote, full of wonder, full of fear. She became pregnant that spring. They planned to call the baby Joanna. The child would never be born. To renovate the farmhouse, the founder had hired a construction crew through Tom Keelock, the driver, fixer, and general factotum who served the Rolling Stones with a loyalty that may or may not have extended to all its members equally. The foreman was a man named Frank Thorogood. He was stocky, hard drinking, and possessed of the particular brand of casual arrogance that tradesmen sometimes adopt when they sense that their employer is vulnerable. The relationship deteriorated quickly. Thorogood and his men treated the property as their own, drinking the owner's beer, swimming in his pool, playing his stereo at volumes that carried across the garden. A bill was presented, £6,000 and rising, for work the founder believed was worth half that amount. He refused to pay in full. The dispute was ongoing at the time of his death. Thorogood had unrestricted access to the house and pool day and night. Remember this. On the 8th of June 1969, three members of the Rolling Stones drove down to Cotchford Farm. Jagger was there. Richards was there. Watts was there. Wyman participated by telephone. The conversation was brief and conducted with the strained politeness of men performing an unpleasant duty they had rehearsed in advance. The official press release, issued the following day, cited disagreements over musical direction. This was partially true. The founder had wanted to return to pure blues, while the band was moving towards the country rock hybrid that would define Let It Bleed. But the real reasons were simpler. 2 drug convictions, no American visa, chronic unreliability, and the growing sense that the man who had given them their name and their sound had become a liability they could no longer afford. His replacement was already chosen. Mick Taylor, a 20-year-old guitarist from John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, was introduced to the press on the 13th of June. He was young, talented, and crucially uncomplicated. The reaction of the man who had been dismissed from his own creation was, by all accounts, unexpectedly calm. He said, "I've known for a long time." There was no rage, no tears. Instead, there were plans. He telephoned Alexis Corner to discuss forming a new blues ensemble. He called Jimi Hendrix, who expressed interest in a collaborative recording session. He spoke to John Lennon, who said simply, "Come over, we'll play." He talked about finishing the Jaujauka recordings, about scoring a film, about a super jazz project that would combine blues, world music, and free improvisation. On the 9th of June, the day after his dismissal, he rang his father in Cheltenham. Lewis Jones's recollection of the conversation, given to a journalist some years later, is the only record of their final exchange. "Dad," his son said, "I've left the group. I'm going to do something real." Lewis Jones replied, "Good, son." The call lasted 5 minutes. Alexis Corner, who visited the farm in late June, noted that the founder seemed happier than he had been in years. He walked the garden of the house where Winnie-the-Pooh had been written and spoke about restoring it as his own refuge. A place where music could be made without the politics, without the lawyers, without the weight of a name that no longer belonged to him. His physical condition remained precarious. He still drank. He still took the barbiturates his doctors had prescribed for insomnia, but Wolin reported that he was making an effort to reduce. The bottles emptied more slowly. There was a sense of someone pulling himself back from a ledge, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with the dogged determination of a man who has glimpsed something worth living for and is not yet ready to let it go. Was the calm genuine? Was it the hard-won peace of a man finally released from a prison he had built around himself? Or was it the numbness of someone who had been hit so many times that the blows no longer registered? The question cannot be answered. What can be said is that for 24 days, from the 8th of June to the 2nd of July, the founder of the Rolling Stones lived in the house of Winnie-the-Pooh in the English countryside, in the last warm days of a decade that was dying around him. 24 days. That was all. The evening of the 2nd of July, 1969, was warm. The English summer, which had been uncharacteristically generous that year, had settled over East Sussex like a soft, golden blanket. The air smelled of cut grass and honeysuckle. The light lingered until nearly 10 o'clock, and even after sunset the sky retained a faint luminosity, that particular quality of English midsummer evenings when true darkness never quite arrives. At Cotchford Farm, 4 people were present. the founder, Anna Wolin, Frank Thorogood, and Janet Lawson, a friend of Thorogood's who happened to be a trained nurse. Tom Keelock had visited earlier but had left, according to his own account. Wolin would later dispute this. The discrepancy has never been resolved. By 9 o'clock they were drinking wine, whiskey. The atmosphere was tense. The founder and Thorogood had argued again about the building bill, £6,000 and climbing, for work that remained incomplete. The argument was not violent. It was the weary, circular sort of dispute that arises between two people who have said everything there is to say and continue saying it anyway. At approximately 11 o'clock, the founder announced that he was going for a swim. The pool was in the rear garden, a rectangular, heated affair, modest by rock star standards, but adequate for a man who enjoyed water and used swimming as a form of relaxation. The water was warm. The night was warm. The combination, for a man with an enlarged heart and a liver twice its proper size, was medically inadvisable. Wolin asked him not to go. He had been drinking for several hours. His judgment was clouded by the prescribed sedatives he had taken earlier in the evening. He went anyway. Thorogood accompanied him to the pool. Lawson remained inside the house. What happened in the next 30 to 45 minutes is the central mystery of this story, and it is a mystery that will almost certainly never be solved. The official account, established by the coroner's inquest and affirmed by the Sussex Police Review of 2009, is as follows. The founder, impaired by alcohol and medication, entered the heated pool and at some point lost consciousness, possibly due to a cardiac arrhythmia triggered by the combination of hot water, a diseased heart, compromised lungs, and central nervous system depression. He sank to the bottom. By the time anyone pulled him out, he was dead. The verdict was death by misadventure, the peculiarly English legal formula that denotes an accidental death resulting from the deceased's own voluntary actions. He had chosen to swim while intoxicated. The intoxication had killed him. No one else was responsible. This is the simplest version. It is almost certainly the closest to the truth. It is also not the only version. Wolin's account, given in her 1999 memoir, was stark. He was at the bottom. I screamed. Frank just stood there. She claimed to have entered the water herself, struggling to lift his body, heavier than her, waterlogged, unresponsive, and to have dragged him to the side with assistance that arrived agonizingly late. An ambulance was called. Lawson attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. It was futile. By the time the paramedics arrived, at approximately 10 minutes past midnight on the 3rd of July, the founder of the Rolling Stones had no pulse. His body temperature was consistent with death 15 to 20 minutes prior. Thorogood told the police he had left the pool area briefly, a few minutes, to go inside the house. When he returned, the swimmer was on the bottom. Lawson had been inside throughout. She heard a scream. She rushed outside. She found the body at the pool's edge and administered artificial respiration. No response. 3 witnesses, 3 versions, none entirely consistent with the others, and one dead man who could not speak for himself. The post-mortem revealed the following. Cause of death, drowning. The liver was enlarged to approximately twice normal size, consistent with advanced fatty degeneration from chronic alcohol abuse. The heart was enlarged. Blood alcohol was equivalent to roughly 5 pints of beer elevated, but not in itself lethal. Traces of a prescribed barbiturate were detected at therapeutic, not toxic levels, and the critical finding was negative. No bruises, no abrasions, no lacerations, no fractures. No signs whatsoever of physical violence. Whatever had happened in that pool, it had left no marks. The coroner's jury returned the verdict of death by misadventure. The police investigation was closed. No charges were filed. The file was archived and the world moved on. It did not stay moved on. In 1993, 24 years after the death, Frank Thorogood allegedly made a confession. The recipient was Tom Keelock, who claimed that Thorogood told him on his deathbed, "It was me." 3 words, no elaboration, no detail, no explanation of method or motive, just, "It was me." Keelock did not report this confession to the police. He reported it to a journalist, and the world, which had largely forgotten about the dead musician from Cheltenham, suddenly remembered and began to argue. The theory runs as follows. Thorogood, enraged by the financial dispute, confronted the founder in the pool. A fight ensued. Thorogood, who was larger and stronger and considerably less intoxicated, held the smaller man's head beneath the water until he drowned. Alternatively, there was no deliberate intention to kill, but a drunken scuffle went too far, and Thorogood, realizing what had happened, concocted a story to cover it. The theory has adherents. Wolin believed it until her dying day. The founder's children, several of whom participated in a documentary film in 2019, have publicly stated their conviction that their father was murdered. The theory has a motive, an opportunity, and a confession. It also has problems. Keelock was not a reliable witness. His own potential involvement made him a compromised source. The confession was hearsay, reported not to the authorities, but to the press, decades after the fact. There was no physical evidence of violence. A second, more elaborate conspiracy theory, involving the Stones' management or their business advisor Alan Klein, produced no documentation whatsoever. Keith Richards, addressing it in his memoir with characteristic bluntness, dismissed it. Nobody killed him. He'd been killing himself for years, and that night he finally managed it. It was a harsh judgment. It was also, in all probability, close to the truth. In 2009, Sussex police conducted a formal review of the case. The conclusion was unambiguous. There are no sufficient grounds to reopen the investigation. The original verdict stood. There is a temptation in telling this story to choose a side. The temptation should be resisted. The truth is that we do not know what happened in that pool, and we almost certainly never will. The witnesses are dead. The forensic evidence is decades old. The confession, if it was a confession, was reported by a man whose credibility was questionable at best. What we do know, what is beyond dispute, is that by the time of his death, the founder of the Rolling Stones was so profoundly alone that there was no one present at the most important moment of his life whom the world could trust to tell the truth about it. He died sometime around midnight, at the boundary between the 2nd and the 3rd of July, 1969, in a heated swimming pool in the garden of the house where Winnie-the-Pooh was written. He was 27 years old. The water was warm. The stars were out. The statue of Christopher Robin stood in the garden, holding its umbrella, gazing at nothing. Somewhere in London, Mick Jagger was rehearsing for a concert. Somewhere in Dartford, Keith Richards was tuning a guitar. Somewhere in Cheltenham, Lewis and Louisa Jones were asleep in the house on El Dorado Road, unaware that their son, The boy who had knocked on the closed door, the boy who had played Chopin under protest and Elmore James in secret, the boy who had fathered 6 children and held none of them long enough, was lying at the bottom of a pool, in the garden of a man who had written stories about a bear of very little brain who was loved by everyone. The news reached the world on the morning of the 3rd of July, in the flat, factual language of wire service reports. Brian Jones, founding member of the Rolling Stones, found dead in his swimming pool. Age 27. Circumstances under investigation. The newspapers ran the story on their front pages, alongside photographs of the blonde-haired musician in his prime, the angelic face, the fur coat, the heavy-lidded eyes that seemed to be looking at something no one else could see. By the following day, the story had migrated to the inside pages. There was a war in Vietnam. There was a crisis in Northern Ireland. There was a moon landing 3 weeks away. The world had other things on its mind. 2 days after his death, 2 days, not 2 weeks, the Rolling Stones played a concert in Hyde Park. The event had been planned weeks in advance, originally intended as a free outdoor performance to introduce Mick Taylor to the public. The death of the founder transformed it, almost overnight, into a memorial, though memorial may be too generous a word for what actually occurred. It was a peculiar and deeply uncomfortable hybrid, part tribute, part publicity exercise, part audition for a new chapter in the band's history that would be written without the man who had begun the story. The crowd was vast. Estimates ranged from 250,000 to 500,000. They filled the park from the Serpentine to the bandstand, a sea of bodies in the July heat, many wearing black armbands or carrying hand-painted signs bearing the dead man's name. Whatever one thought of the Stones' motives, the crowd was sincere. They had come to say goodbye. Jagger appeared on stage wearing a white dress, a frilled, feminine garment designed by the fashionable London tailor Mr. Fish, that seemed calculated to evoke the androgynous aesthetic the founder had pioneered. He held a book. He opened it, and in a voice that wavered between solemnity and self-consciousness, he read from Shelley's Adonais, the elegy the poet had written for John Keats, another young man who had died before his time. Peace, peace. He is not dead, he doth not sleep. He hath awakened from the dream of life. The words hung in the summer air. Then the stagehands released 3,000 white butterflies from cardboard boxes stacked behind the amplifiers. Most of the butterflies were dead. They had been enclosed in the boxes for hours, in the full heat of a July afternoon, and the heat had killed them. The living ones, a minority, fluttered weakly upward, circling the stage in confused, lopsided spirals before dispersing into the park. The dead ones fell. They drifted down onto the crowd like confetti at a wedding. No one had wanted to attend, landing on shoulders and hair and upturned faces, their white wings folded shut, their tiny bodies already stiffening in the sun. It was not a metaphor. It was something that actually happened, and yet it was impossible not to read it as one, a beautiful gesture conceived in haste, executed without sufficient care, that turned out, upon closer inspection, to contain nothing but death. The concert itself was poor. The band had not rehearsed adequately. Taylor was visibly uncertain. The sound system rendered much of the performance muddy and indistinct, but none of it mattered. 500,000 people had not come for the music. They had come for the myth. 1 week later, on the 10th of July, the body was returned to Cheltenham. The funeral was held at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Prestbury, the same church where the founder had been christened 27 years before. The same stone walls, the same arched windows, the same font where water had touched his infant forehead. The coffin was bronze, or, more precisely, a silvered bronze that caught the light as it was carried down the aisle. Charlie Watts was there. Bill Wyman was there. Mick Jagger was not. Keith Richards was not. The official explanation, that they were too upset to attend, was received with varying degrees of credulity by the press, several of whom pointed out that Jagger had been sufficiently composed 48 hours after the death to stand on a stage in a white dress and read Shelley to 250,000 people, but was apparently too distraught 7 days later to sit in a church for an hour. Lewis and Louisa Jones sat in the front pew. The father, the aeronautical engineer who played Chopin, who had disapproved of the blues, who had watched from the doorway as the asthmatic child gasped for breath in the dark, spoke to journalists outside the church after the service. His words have the quality of an epitaph composed by a man who did not know he was composing one. He wasn't happy anymore. Perhaps now he's found peace. Canon Hugh Hopkins, who conducted the service, said in his address, "He was a rebel, but he did not rebel against God. He rebelled against silence." It was an unusually perceptive remark. Whether the canon had arrived at this insight through pastoral intuition or through a briefing from the family is unknown. Either way, it was accurate. The founder had spent his entire life making noise, beautiful noise, chaotic noise, desperate noise, in order to fill the silence that had descended on a house in Cheltenham one winter morning in 1945, when a 2-year-old girl died and nobody opened the door. On the gravestone, in the Priory Road Cemetery, a short drive from the church, the inscription reads, "Brian Jones, founder of the Rolling Stones." The word founder was his. The band never contested it. Of all the victories and defeats in his 27 years, this one, carved in stone, unanswerable, permanent, was the last, and perhaps the only one that endured. There was another mourner whose presence went largely unremarked. Pat Andrews, the mother of his first acknowledged son, had travelled from London with the boy, Julian Mark, who was 7 years old. He was a small, quiet child with his father's fair colouring. At some point during the service, the boy looked at the coffin and asked, "Is that my dad?" His mother said, "Yes." It was the first and last time Julian Mark Andrews would be in the same room as his father. Mick Jagger, speaking in 2003, was cool and guarded. "I feel sorry for Brian, but he chose his path. We tried to help, he didn't want help." Whether the help offered had been genuine or merely gestural, whether help, in the vocabulary of the 1960s music industry, meant anything more than "stop embarrassing us," is a question each listener must answer for themselves. Keith Richards, whose account would not be fully articulated until his memoir Life, in 2010, offered the most complex assessment, complex because it contained, in equal measure, admiration, resentment, guilt, and the particular exasperation that only a former collaborator can muster. He was unbearable. But without him there'd be no Rolling Stones. That's a fact. He put the band together. He named it. He gave it the sound. And then he lost the ability to live. The music outlived all of them. Brian Jones Presents the Pipes of Pan at Jaujauka was released in 1971, 2 years after his death. The album captured the master musicians of the Jaujauka village in the Rif Mountains of Morocco, playing music that had been old when the Roman Empire was young. The pipes wailed, the drums throbbed, the rhythms spiraled and repeated in patterns that seemed to have no beginning and no end. It was the purest thing the founder ever created, made far from London, far from the stones, far from the narcotics and the lawyers, in a landscape of bare rock and blazing sun, among musicians who had never heard of the Rolling Stones and would not have cared if they had. The album is now considered a foundational document of what would later be called world music. It stands as proof that the young man from Cheltenham possessed a musical vision that extended far beyond the 3-minute pop single into territories that Western popular music would not begin to explore for another 2 decades. His contributions to the Stones' own catalogue remain embedded in the band's most celebrated recordings like fossils in sedimentary rock, the marimba on Under My Thumb, the sitar on Paint It Black, the recorder on Ruby Tuesday, the slide guitar on No Expectations. Instrument after instrument, texture after texture, and not a single songwriting credit to show for any of it. Watts had said it first and said it best. The founder was the most talented of them all. What he lacked was not ability, but authorship. And in the music industry, authorship is everything. There have been suggestions, unverifiable, strenuously denied by Jagger and Richards, that some of his ideas were absorbed into compositions credited solely to the partnership. Whether this is true or merely the wishful thinking of those who loved him is impossible to determine at this distance. What is certain is that the arrangements were his, and the arrangements were what made the difference between a good band and an immortal one. His children, 6, possibly 7, grew up scattered across England like fragments of a dropped mirror. Some were adopted and never told. Some learned who their father was only as adults. Julian Mark, the firstborn he had named after Cannonball Adderley, gave rare interviews decades later. Julian Bryan, adopted by Donovan, grew up in another musician's household. The others vanished into private lives. And Joanna, the daughter Anna Wolin had carried through the spring of '69, was never born. The miscarriage came in August, a month after the death, in a Swedish hospital, while her mother grieved alone. None of the children became famous. None inherited significant wealth. All of them carried his face through lives that bore no resemblance to his. Jimi Hendrix, who had played percussion alongside the founder on All Along the Watchtower, and agreed to collaborate on a new project that would now never exist, offered a remark in June of 1969 that would acquire, in retrospect, the terrible weight of prophecy. Brian's a cat with 9 lives. He's used up 8. Within 14 months, Hendrix himself would be dead in a London flat at the age of 27. Then Joplin. Then Morrison. The founder was the first member of a club no one chose to join, not the most famous, not the most mourned, but the first. And in this, as in everything else, his precedence was noted and then forgotten. He was Orpheus. Not in the literal sense. He did not descend into the underworld to rescue a dead lover, but in the structural, mythological sense that gives shape to stories about musicians who are destroyed by their own gift. Orpheus looked back. He was told not to, and he looked back anyway, and in looking back he lost everything. The founder spent his entire life looking back at Cheltenham, at his father, at Anita, at his band, at the brighter versions of himself, and every time he turned his head, another piece of the present slipped away. Cotchford Farm was sold after his death. The house changed hands several times. The garden was maintained. The statue of Christopher Robin remained in its place, holding its umbrella, gazing at the stream. The swimming pool, the heated rectangle of water where the founder had spent his final conscious moments, was filled in by a subsequent owner. Earth was poured into the cavity. Grass was planted over the surface. Where a man had drowned, there was now a lawn. The guitar, a white Vox Mark VI teardrop, the instrument most closely associated with him, its body shaped like a falling tear, passed into private hands. Its current location is unknown. The notebooks were lost. He had kept journals intermittently throughout his adult life, not diaries in the conventional sense, but collections of thoughts, lyric fragments, sketches of melodies, observations about music and the blues. After his death, the notebooks disappeared. They may have been destroyed by the Stones management, who had reason to fear what they contained. They may have been confiscated by the police and mislaid. They may be sitting in a drawer in someone's house, waiting. No one knows. The silence around them is complete. His grave in the Priory Road Cemetery in Cheltenham is modest but well tended. Admirers visit regularly, leaving flowers, guitar picks, handwritten notes. Someone, at some point, no one seems to know when or who, began leaving small figurines of Winnie-the-Pooh beside the headstone. They appear and disappear with the seasons, these tiny plastic bears, placed with care among the cut flowers and the rain-soaked letters, as though the visitors understood, without being told, the connection between the dead musician and the house where a fictional bear had loved a fictional boy, and a real man had tried, one last time, to find his way home. His story was the story of the decade itself. Consider the arc. 1962. A young man with a guitar and a classified advertisement, standing in a rehearsal room in Chelsea, inventing something that did not yet have a name. Innocence. Energy. The intoxicating conviction that the world was waiting to be remade, and that music, raw, electric, borrowed from the Mississippi Delta and reimagined in the damp basements of London, was the instrument of its remaking. He was 20 years old. He had nothing except talent, beauty, and an absolute certainty that the blues mattered more than anything his father had ever placed on a piano. 1965. Ecstasy. The Stones are the biggest band in Britain, rivaled only by the Beatles, and the founder is their most photographed member. The blonde hair, the heavy-lidded stare, the androgynous wardrobe that makes him look like a Renaissance angel who has wandered into the wrong century. Girls scream his name. Journalists compete for his attention. He is, for a brief and dazzling moment, the embodiment of everything the 1960s promised. Freedom, beauty, the overthrow of the old order, the right to feel without apology. 1967, the first cracks, psychedelia, expansion, the sitar and the acid and the sense that consciousness itself could be remade if one only pushed hard enough. But the pushing had a cost. The drugs that were supposed to open doors began to close them. The creativity that had once poured out of him like water from a broken main slowed to a trickle, then to drips, then to silence. The police came. The courts came. The woman he loved left with his best friend. 1969, the end, not just of a man but of an idea. He died on the 3rd of July. The moon landing was 3 weeks away. Woodstock was 6 weeks after that. Altamont, the concert at which the Stones hired Hell's Angels as security, and a man was stabbed to death in front of the stage, was 5 months later. The decade that had begun with his guitar ended with violence, paranoia, and the slow, sickening realization that the dream had been, all along, a lie told by beautiful people to other beautiful people while the world burned around them. He was the canary in the mine. He breathed the poisoned air before anyone else and died before anyone else, and his death, quiet, disputed, half forgotten within weeks, was the first signal that the 1960s were over, not the calendar date, the spirit, the belief that youth and music and love could change anything. He had believed it more fiercely than most. He had also been destroyed by it more completely. There is a tendency in retrospectives and documentaries and anniversary articles to romanticize this destruction, to present it as the inevitable price of genius, as though talent and suffering were connected by some immutable law of the universe, and the brighter the gift, the darker the cost. This is a comforting narrative. It is also a lie. There was nothing inevitable about his death. He did not die because he was talented. He died because he was ill physically, mentally, emotionally, and because the people around him, with a few honorable exceptions, chose to look away. Charlie Watts did not look away. Pat Andrews did not look away. Alexis Corner did not look away. Anna Wolin did not look away. They stayed, each in their own limited fashion, and they bore witness, and they carried the weight of what they had seen for the rest of their lives. But the others, the managers, the advisors, the bandmates who had once shared beds and stolen food and dreamed together in the back of a transit van, they looked away. Not out of malice, perhaps, not even out of indifference, out of self-preservation. Out of the entirely human instinct to distance oneself from a drowning man, lest one be pulled under two. They had careers to protect. They had albums to record. They had a Hyde Park concert to play, and a white dress to wear, and 3,000 butterflies to release into the summer air. One might argue, and many have, that they owed him nothing, that he had brought his destruction upon himself, through the drinking and the drugs and the violence and the endless, exhausting cycle of creation and self-sabotage that had defined his adult life. That a man who fathers 6 children and raises none of them, who beats the woman he loves, who steals from his own bandmates, who cannot arrive at a recording session sober or on time, has forfeited the right to anyone's loyalty. One might argue this, one might even be right, but there is a difference between understanding why someone was abandoned and accepting that the abandonment was just. He was 27. He was alone. He was standing or sitting or lying, depending on the moment, in the wreckage of everything he had built, and the people who had built it with him were somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. That is not justice. It is simply what happened, what remained. The music remained. 60 years after his death, the recordings he shaped, the textures he painted, the colors he chose, the instruments he mastered in an hour and played with the fluency of a lifetime, are still being heard. They are played in cars and cafes and concert halls, and the earbuds of teenagers who have never heard his name and would not recognize his face. The sitar drone of Paint It Black still hypnotizes. The marimba of Under My Thumb still dances. The slide guitar of No Expectations still weeps. These sounds did not die with him. They cannot. They are part of the permanent fabric of popular music, woven so deeply into the culture that they have become invisible, which is, perhaps, the highest compliment a musician can receive, and also the most bitter. The Jaujauka recordings remained. Released 2 years after his death, they introduced Western audiences to a musical tradition that had existed for centuries without their knowledge or permission. The album is still in print. It is still studied. It is still, by any reasonable measure, a work of genuine importance, not because it sold millions of copies, which it did not, but because it expanded the boundaries of what popular musicians were allowed to care about. Before him, rock stars recorded in studios. After him, they recorded the world. The name remained. The Rolling Stones, his name, his choice, his tribute to Muddy Waters and the blues, has endured for more than 60 years. It has survived the death of its founder, the departure of 2 guitarists, the arrival and departure of countless managers and producers and hangers-on, the transition from vinyl to compact disc to streaming, from concert halls to stadiums to pay-per-view, from counterculture to corporate brand. The name has outlived the man who chose it by more than half a century. It will almost certainly outlive everyone who reads these words. Whether this constitutes a victory or a final, cosmic injustice depends entirely on one's definition of ownership, and on whether one believes that creating something gives one any lasting claim to it. The grave remained. Modest, well-tended, visited. The plastic bears appeared and disappeared with the seasons. The silence remained. The silence of the house on El Dorado Road, where a little girl died and a little boy knocked on a door that no one opened. The silence of the hotel room in Tangier, where a man woke to find that the woman he loved had gone. The silence of a recording studio in Barnes, where a musician sat in the corner with his eyes closed while his bandmates worked behind the glass. The silence of a swimming pool in the garden of Winnie-the-Pooh, where the water was warm and the stars were out, and nobody told the truth about what happened. And the question remained. It is not the question that most people ask, not was he murdered, or who was to blame, or what would he have become if he had lived. These are interesting questions, and they have occupied biographers and conspiracy theorists and late-night internet forums for more than 5 decades. But they are not the question that matters. The question that matters is simpler and harder and has no answer. Can a man create something immortal and pay for it with everything he has? He created the Rolling Stones. He gave them their name, their sound, their identity. He heard the blues in a bedroom in Cheltenham and carried them to London and placed them in the hands of musicians who would carry them around the world. He invented textures that had never existed before. He played instruments that no one in rock and roll had thought to play. He built something that will outlast every person alive today. And he paid for it with his childhood, which was stolen by grief, with his relationships, which he destroyed through neglect and violence, with his children, whom he fathered and abandoned, with his health, which he ruined through substances he could not control, with his band, which expelled him, with his sanity, which fractured under the weight of paranoia and loss, with his life, which ended in a swimming pool at the age of 27, in a garden where a bronze boy held an umbrella, and a fictional bear had once said, with the simple wisdom of a creature who knew nothing about the world and understood everything about it, "You're braver than you believe, and stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think." He was all of these things. He was also more fragile than anyone knew. Lewis Brian Hopkins Jones, born the 28th of February 1942 in Cheltenham, Gloucestershire, died the 3rd of July 1969 at Cotchford Farm, Hartfield, East Sussex. founder of the Rolling Stones, multi-instrumentalist, visionary, father of 6, lover of many, friend of few. He knocked on the door. Nobody opened it. He picked up a guitar instead, and the sound he made is still echoing in the grooves of old vinyl, in the hiss of magnetic tape, in the digital streams that carry his music to ears he will never know 60 years after the hand that made it was still. In the end, everyone has their own answer.